And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
He does not take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated by it.
This is the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast with your hosts, Michael Campbell and Greg Howell.
Welcome to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast, and I'm your host, Michael Campbell. My buddy Greg isn't able to join us today, but I am here joined via Zoom with my good friend, Phillip Warfield. And Phil, as I call him, is a PhD candidate at Howard University. Now, I know you can't see, you're listening in, but I can see him on Zoom, and I know he is at the Oakwood University Archives. And it was a few years ago. I know he was a student at Southern Adventist University, where he studied history, among other things. And Lisa Diller introduced us, said, hey, you guys are both up in DC. And we went and had lunch. We've been finding historical sites together, all kinds of fun. But I'm especially excited that you are doing this doctoral research. And so I thought it'd be really fun to have a podcast episode just asking you a little bit about, Phil, what are you up to? Tell us what what are you writing about and researching, and tell us about your passion here for history and this little thing called a dissertation.
Yes, the dissertation. It will have you creating new words like dissertating. Apparently, that's a verb that you can't really find in the dictionary, but we all understand what it means. But thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me on today. But yeah, right now I'm at the Oakwood University Archives here in Huntsville, Alabama. And what I'm doing is trying to answer a particular few questions. One of them is the desegregation question. We know a little bit of the reason why that our Adventist higher education institutions desegregated when they did.
Sure.
But we often don't really get to understand the experience of the faculty and staff and the students especially who were a part of that original experience. And many of them are still alive, especially at the last two institutions that were made to integrate, which were Southern Missionary College, as it was called at the time, and I believe Southwestern Junior College, as it was called at the time. And so these last two institutions, there are people still alive who can tell us the story. And above all, for every institution, we can ask questions about what did it mean to be a Black student in the 1960s and 70s when you have something called the Black Campus Movement? What did that look like on our Adventist higher education campuses? What did that look like? What did it feel like? What happened? These are questions I'm looking for the answers to.
Interesting. So if I'm hearing you right, Phil, you're looking at the whole desegregation. So we're talking 1960s, maybe a little 1970s, but as the civil rights movement really is becoming a thing here in America, and yet what's happening on our Adventist educational institutions, right?
Yes, pretty much. The story, at least you know, in research, sometimes you think that you are going to research one thing, and then it becomes something totally different. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to research desegregation. And then as I did a lot more work and study, I discovered scholars like you who are older than the two of us, who have already kind of just said, oh, this was the first African-American person to come here, whether that was the College of Medical Evangelists or Pacific Union College, et cetera. And some of these colleges, that's right, some of these colleges had their first Black students, even in Atlantic Union College's case, I believe even as early as the 1890s, and PUC, I believe, in the 1880s, there with I'm forgetting his name right now. I'm blanking on his name. Charles Finney. Charles Finney, I believe, was the first Black graduate of Pacific Union College. And
Amazing.
So you would think that, oh, I thought this would happen much later. But instead, you get many of the different institutions already, I guess, on paper integrated. And you hear of some challenging problems that they faced, especially in the case of Emmanuel Missionary College, which is Andrews University today. But then I started to think a little bit more critically about the movement. What happened over time at these different colleges? And so that brought me to really the late 1960s, early 70s.
Interesting. And Adventism's this kind of weird, complex organism, right? So, you have a very diverse, integrated, socially active pioneers in the early days, and then through the early 20th century, I think it's important people know that as historians, we don't always believe in like a Whig view of history that everything is progressing nicely. That while there are advances, sometimes there are times of retrenchment, right? And so we really see in the 20th century where, if I'm hearing you right, there's kind of Adventism does have a period of retrenchment where segregation becomes normative, which seems very antithetical to the early pioneers. And yet here we have the 20th century, and then America's changing. It's desegregating. It's actually becoming more socially progressive than Adventism, and Adventists are forced to have to grapple with this, right?
Yes, absolutely. It would be especially the job of Dr. Frank W. Hale Jr. And
Mm,
many other lay people. I don't
hmm.
want to forget the women who were part of the Committee for the Advancement. It's got a long
Very
name.
important.
Yes,
I know, and
very,
we actually
very
went and
important.
found the place where that was too,
That's right. That's right. They're in Washington, D.C. Can't
Uh-huh.
forget women like Dr. Eva B. Dykes and
Indeed.
others who were
Heroes.
central. That's right. They
Yes.
were heroes central to this movement to get our
Yeah.
Seventh-day Adventist Church with the program. And not necessarily
Yeah.
because they were saying, well, look at what everybody else is doing. They were saying,
Mm,
well, look at what we were. Look at who our pioneers were and what they were agitating for. The
yeah.
pioneers, as your listeners might know, were
Mm,
those who were abolitionists, who were fighting
mm,
against slavery. Yet,
hmm.
over time, as of course the racial nadir in Americans' history and the end of Reconstruction, et cetera, in the 1890s, kind of forced
Right.
Sister White, Ellen White, to say, hey, due to what is happening outside of our Adventist bubbles, and by that I mean our camp meetings and other events, there are whites and blacks, or white people are having a hard time being in the same place with African Americans. It is hurting the ministry. And so let us
Mm,
continue to do the work, but try not to stir up feelings of local agitation. But
right.
that moment in the testimonies becomes like a policy, especially once Ellen White dies, and everything else that she
Mm,
had written about African American work and how the nation owes a debt of love to African Americans, et cetera, seemed to
mm.
just be forgotten over time in favor of, well, Ellen White said, until the Lord shows us a better way. And they were
So it's
still
sort of like a
saying,
proof texting of one incident and then missing the big picture of all this other counsel that she had. Is that right?
absolutely,
Mm,
absolutely. They were completely missing it. It became policy. And as we know, even at the general conference in the
hmm.
cafeteria, it was segregated. And of course, there's the famous Lucy Byard incident there in
Tragic.
1943-44.
Hmm.
Yes, absolutely. A
Mm,
tragic moment in our history. And it took this great committee of people to challenge our church and say, well, we would like Black governed polities, if you will, within the
mm.
church so that
Okay.
we can continue to do our work, but alongside our white brothers and sisters. And of course, that's the
Mm,
regional conference movement there in
yeah.
1944. But then
Yeah.
by the 1960s, Dr. Frank W. Hale Jr. is still saying to us, well, we still have a long way to go. Why are we still
Oh,
segregated now after
yeah.
Brown v. Board of Education in 54?
Right.
Why are
Right.
we one of the last churches to release any kind of, as they would say in those times, human relations statements, which we did in
Mm,
1961? But we were
hmm.
still behind most churches who had once celebrated slavery. The
Mm.
Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church, they had all Catholic Church. They'd all of them had released these statements, and the Adventist Church was
Wow.
silent. So it took a
So we were
movement of
falling
people.
behind.
Yes, yes, we were falling behind both in our
Mm,
mission and, of course, just what was happening with the federal government and United States as a
hmm.
whole. Moving,
Yeah.
were totally different, and the Adventists were still wondering, well, what should we do? I think we'll just stay
Hmm.
right put. But it took a movement of people, as Dr. Samuel London talks about in his book, Seventh Day Adventist and Civil Rights Movement, to
Hmm.
move
Hmm.
us
Great
forward,
book,
to
by the
push
way.
us forward.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Mm, mm. So now we're coming back to your research. So you're narrowing down your topics. So you're going from the broader subject of desegregation, obviously crucial topic, really important. And I love that you're narrowing it down. And I remember my advisor telling me, Michael, you got the rest of your life to write about all these other topics you want to write about, like what you're talking about. You keep finding all these, sometimes they're rabbit trails, sometimes they're good, but more often than not, they're rabbit trails. They're good rabbit trails, but you have to stay focused, and so now you're focused on our schools. So are you focusing on all of our NAD colleges, or are you focusing on specific ones? I heard you mention Oakwood and Southwestern. Fill me in a little bit more on how you're narrowing or delimiting your topic. By the way, we may have some future historians listening to this, so they may be thinking future dissertation topics, right? So don't be afraid to put those out there. Some young historian may be saying, "Hey, man, I can't wait to pick up the work of Phillip Warfield," and so the quest continues on.
That's right. That's right. Research is never definitive. One's book is never definitive. There's always
Right.
new knowledge that
Keep
you
learning.
can gain depending on sources you can find.
Yeah.
And that's really what it comes down to.
Mhm.
Dr. London did an excellent job with his book. And even
Yeah.
while here at Oakwood, I've had the chance to talk with him. And I told him, I said,
Excellent.
well, you were thorough. You were
Uh-huh.
really good.
Yeah.
But I got hung up over one paragraph where you just
Really.
mentioned how Southwestern and Southern, after the work of Dr. Hale Jr. and his Layman's Leadership Conference, they began to integrate. And I thought near the end of the book, that's where that was written. And I thought, man,
Yeah.
I wonder what that was like. I wonder what
Yeah.
those experiences were like. What does that look like outside of just a policy? Which led
Sure.
me into this research. And
So
so
this is
that
this
brought me,
lacuna,
yeah,
right? So he
yeah. Mhm.
dangled the apple in front of you, Phil, and you took it.
I sure did. I sure did. And he was writing this in like, oh, what is it, 2009? And here we are
Yeah, it's been a few
over
years. Yeah.
15 years later.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking,
Love it.
well, I think there's a little bit more. And so with that
Hmm.
story, I decided, well, not just Southwestern or Southern, but of course, Oakwood, Atlantic Union College, Andrews, Union, Adventist University now,
Sure.
Pacific
Hmm.
Union College, Walla Walla
Hmm.
University, Loma
Hmm.
Linda, La Sierra. I decided to look at almost everybody here in the United States. I even
Interesting.
have investigated Kettering to see what I could find.
Hey, what about
Um,
our Canadian brothers and sisters? Did you check Berman?
I did not, only because, and
Yeah.
shout out to you, Michael. But Canada would, I think, problematize my research just a little
All
bit
right.
because,
Okay. This
you
Canadian's
know,
heart, so maybe someone's listening and says, "Hey, we'll study that." And Advent. The only reason I mention that is the Canadians were always the ones critiquing the Americans, the Adventist Americans, like in the 1920s and 30s, saying, "What are you guys doing with the Ku Klux Klan?" So it was the Canadian Adventists that they were far enough removed they could say, that's not cool. And so they actually wrote some critiques, but anyways, that's for another time. Sorry, Phil, that's my own rabbit trail
that
there. So
that is still really interesting
yeah,
because I
yeah,
have wondered. I'm like, well, I wonder if the Berman students were seeing what was happening at the schools
yeah.
down here and thinking, "Whoa, you all are being maybe a little bit racist or prejudiced," and I
I
wonder
wonder.
what their
Yeah.
reactions could be. And I don't know if I can get all the way to that archive in the next couple of months. That could be for the book and not the dissertation, but
There you
it's
go.
worth it
There
to
you
think
go.
about.
Indeed. So, yeah, I was looking at a different era, of course, but that'll be interesting. But so you're looking at the United States Adventist colleges and universities, and tell us more.
Yes, well, I really wanted to see not just, we have the story of Southern and Southwestern
Yeah.
integrating, but what are the rest of the schools saying during this time? Are they critical of the civil rights
Hmm.
movement? And are they critical of the Black campus movement, which is this period of student unrest on campus as they
Hmm.
agitate
Hmm.
for being more properly represented in the curriculum,
Sure.
as well as in leadership and faculty as well?
Hmm.
What are they saying? And how
Hmm.
do we get Black student unions, or what some of our colleges have called Black Christian unions, or Black student
Hmm.
Christian forums? How do we get these things? Because in truth, what I have seen is that you have the secular Black campus movement, which is
Hmm.
really relying on Black Power tenets, and in some cases is actually more so anti-religious. But
Mm,
then you have the same movement happening on our Adventist campuses. So how can you
wow.
have the same movement, but in theory, it's supposed to be more anti-religious? So instead, what I'm seeing these Adventist young people do is that they are quoting the works of Ellen White and others in order to agitate for what they believe is a requirement of Adventist institutions. They're saying to
Mm,
Loma Linda University administration, we want to form an Afro American club. We want a place on campus. We want there to be
yeah,
minority scholarships and funding.
yeah.
And we want you to listen to us. And we are asking that you also consider the voices of Dr. Frank Hale and others
Mm,
who would help us with our needs. And you know what? Loma Linda University actually meets those demands, those proposals.
really, really
And
interesting.
they do. They do. I found these things in the Board of Trustees minutes. This movement is happening across our colleges, and I've just been surprised that I haven't really seen people write about this. And these people, many of them, those doctors, for example, those students who went on to become medical doctors at Loma Linda, some of them are still alive, the leaders of that movement. And so it's been a joy to talk with them.
Interesting. Well, this is fascinating because I'm wondering, one of the things as historians, we think about regions of the country, right? And how different regions responded. And I imagine it'd be interesting as you're piecing this all together, um, if we see patterns that are also resembling different kinds of things within Adventism too. So um and 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 I imagine you had some assumptions too. You're coming to this. You're starting out with Southern, Southwestern, Oakwood. Um, that's where some of the racial prejudices were the strongest, weren't they? Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We're in the South, and as a late historian, Dr. Dennis Pettibone, had once said in a video that the Ku Klux Klan monitored Southern's campus at one point. We know
Interesting.
that there was a cross burning in
Hmm.
Collegedale as well. And of course, the research that you have done shows us that the Ku Klux Klan and was pretty active there in the southwestern region of the United States. And some Adventists may have, unfortunately, been a part of such a thing.
More
Um,
than may have, they were.
yes, yes,
Tragically,
definitely.
tragically, now looking back
Tragically, they were.
with history, but yeah, we were taking some steps backwards there, Phil.
That's right. That's right. And so it's easy to start off here looking at the Collegeville, Tennessee, and Keene, Texas, and
Mm,
of course here in Huntsville, Alabama, where Dr.
right.
London writes Black students from Oakwood tried to go to a white Adventist church here. And the elder said to them, I have 6 bullets for 6 N-words right there in church service, and refused to allow them to enter the sanctuary. We
Literally
have those
threaten them with with
moments.
with a gun, eh? That
Absolutely.
that breaks my heart, Phil. That really breaks
Yes,
my heart to think that we ever got to that point. But I realize, history, when we do history, Phil, we have to write the history that we find, not the history that we wish we had found, right?
yes, absolutely.
So this
And
is probably one of those moments.
I'm confronted with that same sentiment as I look through the Spreading Oak, which
Mm,
is Oakwood University's student newspaper. And I'm
okay.
seeing some of the students write maybe I would say antitheses to the Black Power movement. Some of them
Okay.
are not happy about it, while
Mhm.
others are saying we should be a part of civil rights demonstrations. And that's hard because you think, oh, the even the African American Adventist students are not too sure about joining this movement, but it just shows us that these things are complicated. And like you said,
Sure.
history is not always in this perfect progressive kind of line as we like to think that it is. People have varying opinions. You
Sure.
would think today, why not join the civil rights movement? But it behooves us to remember that Dr. King Jr. was one of the most hated men in the United States, especially by the
At the
time of
time.
his death. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. So in the same way, we're going to find different opinions on Seventh-day Adventists wanting to show up and be a part of the Black Power movement or not, or the Civil Rights
Mm-hmm.
movement or not. They will say different things like, oh, maybe this is Marxist, or they'll say, actually, this is Christ-like, and this is a movement of brotherhood. You'll find different
Yeah.
opinions. So that's why I'm here at Oakwood, because I could have just said, well, this is more so a Black person entering a white space problem. But no, even here at Oakwood University, students are reacting to what's happening outside of their campus here and whether or
Right.
not they should be a part of it.
Yeah. Well, it takes a certain moral courage to stand up for what is right, even when it's unpopular. And so I think it's very easy when we think of history, we like to write ourselves back into history as being the heroes, as always being the but this is always the challenge is not how did we live in our minds in the past, but how do we live in the present? So how do we allow those things from the past to inform our own lives, right? And I found this to be true when I was teaching Adventist history some years ago. One of my best friends, religion teacher, I don't think he minds if I share this, but Buster Swoops, Buster, and is the
Absolutely.
middle of the Black Lives Matter. And I realized, you know what? If I really teach these things about our early Adventist pioneers being abolitionists and fighting against injustice, then I have to be willing to go with my colleague, hold his hand, and go march and walk together and listen and hear those stories. And I think it's important that we not just talk about the past, but we have to let the past inform the present. And only to the extent that we do that is actually history then becomes not only an academic exercise, it becomes something more. Is that fair
Yes,
to
the
say?
Seventh Day, absolutely. The Seventh Day Adventist movement is a protest movement in nature. And I believe I'm
Yeah.
borrowing that from Dr. Kevin Burton. Um,
Yeah.
and because it is a protest movement, we have to remember, of course, we're a part of the Protestant faith, that
Yeah.
protest does not end. And for us as Seventh day Adventists, remembering what our pioneers not only wrote, but did, and
Yeah.
how even in the 1960s, 100 years later,
Yeah.
many of those Seventh day Adventists were still saying, well, this is the movement that we're a part of. And so this is what we are going to do to help our church move forward in its mission. I think is something that's important for us to remember today, 60 plus years
Mhm.
later, that we are a
Interesting.
part of a protest movement. And so you have this
Yeah.
period called the Long Black Campus Movement. You have the New
Yeah. Tell
Negro
us about
movement
that.
of the
Yeah.
1930s.
Yeah.
But then in the 1960s, you get, of course, the Black Campus Movement, which is more so
Mm.
student activism on campus. But what
Right.
I think that historians, of course, because it's rather recent, we haven't really talked too much about is what's happening in the 2010s. Sure, you get Black Lives Matter in that movement, but something else is
Right.
happening on campuses. And what I'm hoping that I can sort of include in my research, whether that's for the
Mm.
dissertation or the book, is that in the last about 10, 11 years, our Adventist institutions have almost all of them have made some sort of institutional apology for the past racist ills. Um,
Interesting. Wow.
we all know about It Is Time AU in
Hmm.
2017. However,
Hmm.
Southern in 2018 also did that. And I'm kind of doing a humble brag because I was one of the people who let that out during that
Yeah, you
time.
were you were a student. In fact, I think you were SA president, weren't you?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right. And so
Hmm.
in February 2018, we do that work there at Southern and they make an institutional
Mm.
apology. Andrews in
Beautiful.
2017, Union Adventist University in 2014, a student, Kyle Berg, I believe, does some research that shows that Union, even in Nebraska, was segregated as well. And brings this research together, and the institution does make a formal apology. And so you find that at each of our institutions, something like that has happened. Even at Atlantic Union College, that same sort of thing happened shortly
Mm.
before they closed. And so there's a
Interesting.
different movement there that also
Mm.
sometimes forces and sometimes really Adventist administrators say, you know what, something is the matter here. Something
Mhm.
wrong did occur, and it is my responsibility to move us forward in faith and say, you know what, I was not there personally, But as the person in charge of this institution now, I have a responsibility to say, oh, we should have done better, and here's how we're going to do so. And so you have this moment in the last 10 years that definitely I'm also going to be writing about.
Interesting. So fascinating. Because we have what we think is history, what we know, and then people come along like you and do research and find new things and say, hey, by the way, the story that we thought we knew is actually more complex. It's complicated, and it's maybe a little bit more messy than we thought it was. And because of that, it sparks new conversations saying, hey, what does this mean in the interim time that since this has occurred, and what does that mean for us now? And I love that a number of our institutions have seen that and said, hey, we don't want to be like that. We're going to move in a different direction, and to actually repent, to repent of that.
That's right. That's right. That's the mission. And we just want to be able to, I want to be able to showcase that in the research and help Seventh-day Adventists remember that they are part of a long movement. This isn't something that has changed due to political changes or people trying to be socially correct, or this is a part of our Adventist faith.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think some people are a little bit scared of this history, scared to discover this history, right? And they're afraid, and the accusation is then you're woke and somehow some kind of woke history or whatever. And the implication is that you're just being influenced by secular trends and trying to be popular by being politically correct or those kinds of things. And that's not what I'm hearing you say. What I'm hearing you say is that as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, our biblical values, our biblical foundation of truth should guide us, so that when we're dealing with these issues in the wider culture and society, allows us to critique what's going on, but also we don't have to be afraid to be activists, to make the changes we need, not because other people are or are not doing them, but we do it because that is what we believe. That is our biblical foundation. That's our Adventist values, our heritage. And we can do better. We can do better. By the way, this brings me back to public history. I know it's something you're passionate about. What is public history? Someone's listening into this podcast. They may not be in tune with all the different kinds of history. I know it's something you're passionate about. You've been doing some work with the Smithsonian, one of the Smithsonians at least. Tell us a little bit some of your broader work that you've been doing and involved in. Part of the reason I'd like to ask you this is, again, there may be some people interested in pursuing a vocation of history. And so I want to see kind of the creativity that and breadth of things that you love to do. I know this is your passion, Phil.
Yeah, sure. So public history, I didn't really even know that it existed actually until I got to Howard University and discovered the great public history program led by the great Dr. Elizabeth Clark Lewis. And I discovered all the work that it has taken for us to remember things like the Civil Rights Movement, but I mean like physically, tangibly, the work that people have done to save the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House in DC, Frederick Douglass's home, all kinds of things. And so in the last couple of years, I've been an intern at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture there in Washington, DC, and I've learned plenty of what it means to protect the dignity of Black people over time and how we do that. And so public history really is what we all should be doing, not just as academicians, but as people who want to protect history. And so a lot of what I do right now has just been in the writing. It's of the recording of oral history interviews, because I'm hoping one day to give them back to an Adventist institution. Maybe that's the Center for Adventist Research there with Dr. Kevin Burton, to make sure that we can somehow, maybe later on, we can create some sort of exhibition or something like that that will showcase some of the research that all of us have done to remember what Adventism has been, what it was, what it should be. Because you're right, that oftentimes people will say, oh, you've just been influenced by woke ideology or something like that. And in reality, Michael, I knew who Ellen White was before I knew who Frederick Douglass was, before I knew who Stokely Carmichael was. If anything, I'm influenced most by my Adventist upbringing and the work that I have read, and that includes the Southern work, what Ellen White wrote, and Our Duty to the Colored People. I read those things before I knew who Frederick Douglass was and other Black freedom soldiers, if you will. And so I'm most influenced by the work that people in our faith have done to move us forward. And that is really kind of the guiding key for me, even as I have gotten to have some sort of self-knowledge. It is now, okay, I have this knowledge. So now what am I going to do with it in the outside world? And how am I going to continue to serve and protect Black history in a time where it's very difficult to do so?
Interesting. So coming back, you mentioned oral histories. Here you're doing your dissertation. Obviously, you're using print sources. Tell us the kinds of things you've been looking for. What are some of the things you've been finding? What did you not expect? Or some things you did expect? Talk to us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of this research process. I love this, Phil.
Research is fun, and in reality, I'm someone who's a bit of a perfectionist. And I thought for so long, I need to read absolutely everything in order to finally sit down and begin to write. Now, of course, they tell us that a good dissertation is a done dissertation. And so I decided, well, I do need to start writing a little something. And so I've kind of learned as I've gone along. As I've gone to each institution, I've learned just, I suppose, new ways to creatively research. I came in with a plan. I'm just going to look at the student newspapers. And I thought, oh, Board of Trustees minutes are available. Let me look at those and see what I can find. And because I've done that before, because I've done that and looked at presidential papers as well, I've seen the sorts of dialogue and correspondence that presidents are having with students that they think might end up being, quote, troublemakers. I've seen what students are reacting to in the broader world. And so, of course, your viewers can't see this, but I am literally holding an Oakwood University student newspaper from 1972. And I've looked at the 60s, and I've put my hands on Board of Trustee minutes, and it's incredible stuff. You can't see these things online just yet. They're not
Right.
digitized.
Yeah.
And so some of these things I feel have not been touched in a long, long time. The pages are
They
yellow.
probably haven't.
You have to be careful. The Board of Trustees minutes, you're in my case, because pretty much all of my family went to Oakwood except for me. I'm seeing literally my ancestors in these papers. I'm seeing my
Okay.
grandmother. I'm seeing my
Sure.
grandfather. I'm putting my hands on the things that they have
You see
written,
names
done.
pop out at you, huh? They're like, I
That's
know who
right.
that is.
That's right. That's right. So research also can be personal. And that's something
Mhm.
that I feel like most people forget.
Interesting. I love it. I love how you're finding all these different kinds of sources, and what we like to call primary sources. Primary
Absolutely.
sources. So, by the way, just curious from a researcher standpoint of view. You've talked a lot about. You've mentioned oral histories. You've mentioned minutes. You've mentioned periodicals, things like that. Any letters or correspondence? Have you picked up any of that along the way in different places in your endeavors?
Certainly, certainly. One particular piece of correspondence really sticks out to me. In the heat of student unrest in about 1969, there
Hmm.
is a president of one of our colleges who, upon the election of the first Black Student Association president of that college, there are rumors already about this Black SA president that he is going to start a movement, that he is going to start a big protest against the college. And it's the
Wow.
summertime. He's not even on campus. No one's on campus. So the
Mm.
president sends a letter to this student saying, hey, I heard that this might be happening. Would you be able to present what you are actually planning to do in your term as president? And that student says, Well, no, sir. I am not planning to do any sort of protest. I don't know where you're getting that information from,
Yeah.
but that's not what I'm here to do. And regardless of whether that student choosing to protesting or not, that's really not really the main point of this. But me finding that letter was just like a light bulb moment of, wow, this Black Student Association president hasn't even done anything yet. And in some ways, he's being surveilled and he's being asked
Mm,
probing questions for things that
interesting.
he's not even, he doesn't get the privilege, if you will, to just be able to say the fun things we usually hear. I want to change cafeteria prices or something like that. No, instead, he's made out to be a possible troublemaker, and he hasn't even done anything
Ooh,
yet.
wow. Yeah, this is fascinating. And when you find those pieces of correspondence, suddenly the past starts coming to life with the color and the intensity of that moment, right? Of all of that. Wow. So for someone else that's in graduate school or wanting to pursue history and so on, um, what drives you, Phil? Tell us a little bit more of Phil as a person, as the historian. How, what made you so interested and passionate about history?
Well, I believe that journey of passion and history for me begins when I'm about 3, 4 years old. My mother was at Andrews University finishing up her degree, and I believe she had to take a history course. And the story goes that she would come home from class and trying to study, she would say all the things she needed to know to me, and I would say it back to her. It was like I could just soak it up without a problem. And so that's the way I've always been, whether it was with my
Mm,
grandparents on long car rides, because my grandmother is now retired, but she was an Adventist administrator for both regional conferences, union conferences. And so she was often a
mhm,
delegate to general conference sessions and things like that. But on the
mhm,
way to these sorts of sessions, I would have the map in the back. And of course, they knew where to go. And MapQuest was great in those days. But I would point out things like, oh, I would love to see on the way to St. Louis at the 2005 General Conference session. I would love to see the George Washington Carver Memorial there, just way off the beaten path there in Missouri. And they were like, well, we don't see that on the map, but we'll trust you in your directions. And so I led them there at just 9 years old using the map. And it made my grandfather's day, my late grandfather. He just loved it.
mm,
And he consistently inspired that path and passion of pursuing Black history, especially.
mhm,
And so I think mostly my grandfather, the late Melvin Warfield Sr.,
mhm,
always wanted me to know myself and to know where I come from and know my history. And because he was my acting father, that meant a lot to me. And so I carry his passion and name forward. And once I was at Southern and really wanted to make history come alive as a student association president, I wanted to help our institution reckon with all the things that I had heard growing up about that
mm,
institution. And once we did that, I was really thinking, well, I really want to pursue something more. I felt like I was the only one sort of doing that work. And I discovered that there's a much broader world when the great Lisa Diller said to me, I think you should apply to Howard University. And I said,
nice.
Howard, really? The place of Thurgood Marshall, and of course, Chadwick Boseman, and Kamala Harris, all these other people.
Yeah.
And I applied, I got in and have been more acquainted with history, and it's become far more personal to me. It is not just this thing that I study, this thing that I enjoy for critical thinking and practicing that. No, it's become a personal journey, a journey of self rediscovery, as I call it.
Love it. Love it. So, for any aspiring historians out there, what advice would you have for them?
Ask yourself the probing questions about yourself, but also about
Mhm,
your world,
mhm,
because no one can tell the story quite like you can. And that is great responsibility and great power. So you kind of it sounds weird to say, but I read this in a book about research, but you have to develop the skills of being a self-centered researcher. That doesn't mean that you're selfish and that you're only thinking about yourself. It means thinking about questions that really excite you. Because when you're excited about your research, you might have the opportunity to change the way that the broader public considers a big question. So if you're going to pursue graduate study, really hone in on the questions that mean a lot to you. And the maybe for me as a social historian, the people who interest you most, their culture, their traditions, and why are you interested? Once you start to put those questions together, you start to form, I suppose, your own philosophy of research and teaching and further education.
Anything so so I love that. I think it really does come back down to this passion, Phil. Like you have to have this passion. If you don't have this passion, it's not going to become passion suddenly. You have to have it to begin with, and love what you do. And I see that in you. I see that glint in your eye when we're wandering around trying to find historic sites together, different kinds of things. You have that sparkle, and I love it. And I hope that there's somebody listening that listens to this conversation and will be inspired as a result and will catch it. It's kind of history can be a little bit contagious sometimes, right? You start seeing what's possible and you start seeing how this happens in the process of it. And you say, you know what? I love it. I'm all in. And I hope this will inspire someone else. But before we wrap up, I always like to give an opportunity. Maybe I didn't ask a question in our conversation, just something you want to highlight that was you are excited about, or something that in relation to your research and our conversation together.
Well, I'm especially encouraged to know that as a student, an undergraduate student at Southern Adventist University, I thought that I was alone in the sort of work that I wanted to do and how I wanted to challenge us to be better and to be more inclusive. And what I discovered was that I was far from being the only one, um, and that there are many women and men out there who have done the work historically. And maybe it's not through academia, maybe it's being a community activist, maybe it's just being the librarian that's fighting to ensure that books that celebrate our history are still on the shelves. But I would say to anyone out there, I really want you to join the fight and to think
Mm.
critically about not just your world, but about what, if you're a Seventh Day Adventist, what the Adventist pioneers were writing about, especially when it comes to what we need to do for those who at the time were disenfranchised. African Americans were not acted upon. I should be clear and say African Americans also did their own work to further the gospel, but also to educate themselves and to liberate themselves. But we also need to really consider the ways that we need to continue to push that forward, to continue to do that work, even when it gets difficult, when politics around us might make that work more difficult. We need to continue to do so and know that you're not alone. Find that community. And if you can't, look to the annals of history because it will absolutely show you that you're not by yourself and that there are people who have cared for a very, very long time. Join the fight, however, the gifts you've been given. Go out there and do what you need to do.
Well, you've been listening to Phillip Warfield. Phil, thanks so much for sharing your passion for our Adventist past, how we can learn from it, and the kind of exciting things that you are discovering. I want to wish you well. I think you know this already, but just as a friend, as a colleague in the historical profession here, as you're pushing through to that final, all the way to the very end. And so I'll be praying for you and cheerleading you on. So excited for the work that you're doing. So courage to you. And for our listeners, thank you for joining us each month as we delve deeper into our Adventist past, looking at incredible new sources and historians that are doing creative research. And we want to entice you with some of the best of historical Adventist historical scholarship that is going on out in the wider world. So thank you, Phil, again, and thank you to our listeners for joining us at the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. Join us again next month for a fresh episode into our Adventist past.
Thank you so much.
And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
He will not take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated